Welcome to Washington Today for Monday, October 16, 2023. I'm Gary Sterhoff. Thanks a lot for joining us. Secretary of State Antony Blinken was back in Israel today after visiting 6 Arab countries over the past 4 days. He reaffirmed U.S. support to Israeli Defense Minister Yoav Gallant. We'll hear what both of them had to say coming up. The House of Representatives is back in session today at 6 p.m. Eastern before a possible vote for Speaker at noon tomorrow. And at 6:30 Eastern tonight, House Republicans are expected to hold another meeting in an effort to build support for Jim Jordan to be the next Speaker. He became the nominee on Friday, but the latest count shows him short of the 217 votes he'll need on the floor to take the gavel. And we'll get a preview of Episode 5 of Books That Shaped America. Tonight's program looks at The Common Law by Oliver Wendell Holmes, Jr. He wrote the book based on a series of lectures he had given on criminal and civil law 2 decades before he would become a Supreme Court justice. We begin in Tel Aviv, where Secretary Blinken's visit came amidst the sound of air raid sirens there and in Jerusalem. This was the second meeting in less than a week between Secretary Blinken and Israeli Defense Minister Gallant.
Mr. Secretary, thank you for coming. Minister. We always knew that the United States is a great ally. But today, the people in Israel and in the world see it in their own eyes. You are here, second time in this week. Senior officials of America are here every day. And the American flag is sailing on board in the Mediterranean. And we know what is the meaning. So let me tell you, Mr. Secretary, this will be a long war. The price will be high, but we are going to win for Israel, for the Jewish people, and for the values that both countries believe in.
Thank you, Mr. Minister. You know our deep commitment to Israel's right, indeed its obligation, to defend itself and to defend its people. And in that, you have and will always have the support of the United States. Thank you.
Thank you very much, sir.
And the Wall Street Journal reporting today that more than 1,400 Israelis have died since the Hamas assault began. Israel said 289 of its soldiers have been killed. And in Gaza, officials said Palestinian death toll is at 2,808. The number of U.S. citizens killed has risen to 30, while 13 remain unaccounted for. And last night, in an interview on 60 Minutes, President Biden said he thinks a new Israeli occupation of Gaza would be, quote, a big mistake. His comments come as Israel is expected to launch a ground invasion there soon.
Would you support Israeli occupation of Gaza at this point?
I think it'd be a big mistake. Look, what happened in Gaza, in my view, is Hamas and the extreme elements of Hamas don't represent all the Palestinian people. And I think that it would be a mistake for Israel to occupy Gaza again.
Do you believe that Hamas must be eliminated entirely?
Yes, I do.
You would like to see humanitarian supplies brought into Gaza?
Yes.
So you do not agree with the Israeli total siege of the Gaza Strip?
I'm confident that Israel is going to act under the rules of war. There's a standards that democratic institutions and countries go by. And so I'm confident that there's going to be an ability for the innocents in Gaza to be able to have access to medicine and food and water.
Is it time for a ceasefire?
Now, look, there's a fundamental difference. Israel is going after a group of people who have engaged in barbarism that is as consequential as the Holocaust. And so I think Israel has to respond. They have to go after Hamas.
The Washington Post writing today, quote, Biden's warning against reoccupying Gaza amounted to one of his firmest efforts so far to impose a limit on Israel's actions in retaliation for Hamas's attacks that have killed at least 1,400 people. The president was also asked about the violence in northern Israel and the role Iran's government could be playing behind the scenes.
There's limited fighting already on the northern Israeli border, and I wonder, what is your message to Hezbollah and its backer, Iran?
Don't. Don't
come across the border. Don't escalate this war.
That's right.
Is Iran behind the Gaza war?
I don't want to get into classified information, but to be very blunt with you, there is no clear evidence of that.
At this point, no evidence that Iran is behind any of this.
Correct. Now, Iran constantly supports Hamas and Hezbollah. I don't mean that. But in terms of did they have foreknowledge? Did they help plan the attack? There's no evidence of that at this point.
Parts of President Biden's interview on 60 Minutes last night. You can get full coverage of the U.S. response to the Hamas terror attacks, including Secretary Blinken's visit today and all of President Biden's statement at cspan.org and on the free C-SPAN Now mobile app. Back here in Washington, the House is scheduled to gavel in at 6 p.m. Eastern for a brief session and a possible floor vote for Speaker coming tomorrow at noon. House Republicans are expected to hold a meeting at 6:30 p.m. tonight to continue to build support for Jim Jordan of Ohio to be their next Speaker. He became the nominee on Friday, but of course he needs 217 votes. That's a majority of the total House on the floor to get the job. And as the day has gone on, more and more Republican members who previously held out support for Jim Jordan are now saying they will vote for him. That list includes key members like Ken Calvert of California, Ann Wagner of Missouri, and Vern Buchanan of Florida. Also chiming in was Warren Davidson of Ohio, who posted this on X.
Hi, I'm Congressman Warren Davidson. I just got back into Washington, D.C. and wanted to give you an update. Obviously, Republicans are focused on electing the next Speaker of the House. Tonight, all the various factions of the Republican Party will meet together. We'll have a nice discussion, and I'm optimistic that tomorrow on the floor of the House, we'll elect Jim Jordan as the next Speaker of the House. It's time to get back on offense.
And Nicole Maliotakis of New York spoke about her support for Jim Jordan on Fox News.
Yeah, I'm hopeful that we will get a speaker this week. We have to get a speaker this week. There are too many world events taking place. Our friend, ally, Israel needs our support. We need to make sure we secure our border. We need to use the leverage in the upcoming appropriations process to get our border secure. We passed our legislation in May. Senator Schumer refuses to take action. But seeing what we're happening around the world, it would be ridiculous if the Senate and the White House did not work with us to finally secure our border here at home. I'm hopeful that my colleagues in the Republican House will put aside our differences and see that we must unify for this moment. There needs to be leadership. We do not often see it from the White House, and the Senate, unfortunately, it does not take up a lot of the legislation that we've passed over or pass their own legislation. So we must unite as a conference so we can move our country forward. There's just too much at stake at this time.
House Democrats, meanwhile, have stayed united behind their leader, Hakeem Jeffries of New York. But regardless of how tomorrow's vote goes, House Intelligence Ranking Member Jim Himes of Connecticut says further Republican disarray will just increase the stakes for the nation's business.
Yeah, it's obviously very painful and hardly ideal. You know, and the chairman and I have, in this Congress, deliberately worked in tandem together in a bipartisan fashion. So it's hard to see the House brought to a standstill. I do hope that in the next week or so we can get our act together, because it's not just the national security package that Mike just described, which is critical. It's critical for Israel, critical for Ukraine, critical for the Pacific. It's also the budget. The clock is ticking on the budget. And, you know, the last thing we want to do is be approaching a government shutdown without clarity as to who's leading the House.
House Intelligence Ranking Member Jim Himes speaking on MSNBC. The Senate started their work today at 3 p.m. after a week-long recess. And in his Leader Time remarks, Democratic leader Chuck Schumer talked about his recent trip to Israel.
The most memorable meeting was with 12 families of the hostages. There they were, sitting there, wondering what was happening to their mother, their sister, their brother, their baby in the hands of these brutal terrorists. Nothing prepared us for the overwhelming grief we felt talking to the families of the hostages and sharing their deep pain. There was not a dry eye in the room, Many of these people didn't know if their relatives were dead or alive. Some of them said, "I wonder which is better." They just knew that they were missing and taken by wretched Hamas fighters. It breaks your heart. We saw footage they showed us of their loved ones being led away by the Hamas terrorists. An elderly woman being dragged away from her family. A 12-year-old boy being pushed along by these terrorists. Families in sheer agony, wondering what was happening to their loved ones in the captivity of these brutal terrorists. Today, we now know that the number of hostages has exceeded 199. It is of the utmost importance that Israel and the United States do everything it can to bring every single one of these hostages to safety. During our visit, we also experience in flashes what the Israelis experience on a daily basis. We were having lunch at our hotel when the sirens went off, meaning rockets were only 7 to 9 minutes away, rockets fired by Hamas. We all rushed into a shelter and waited with bated breath until they told us the coast was clear. It happened again in the evening, moments before a press conference that had to be delayed that we held on Sunday. For us, the danger was momentary, thank God. But it's harrowing to think that Israelis are going through this and much greater horrors every single day. So again, as the first Jewish majority leader, the highest-ranking Jewish official in America, someone who has knowledge of the persecutions and ravages that have affected the Jewish people through the decades, the centuries, the millennia, I felt an obligation to travel this weekend to Israel and deliver a message of partnership.
On the Republican side, Leader Mitch McConnell also shared stories he has heard about the Hamas terrorism.
Since the Senate last convened, terrorists have sent shockwaves through the civilized world with savage, cold-blooded violence. On October 7th, Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad desecrated Israel's soil and tore apart Israeli families with utterly medieval brutality. Like ISIS, terrorists from Gaza turned peaceful homes and neighborhoods in Israel into blood-soaked war zones. It was the deadliest attack on Israelis and on American citizens overseas in decades. But now, reports and images of these horrific scenes have spread widely. Accounts of Israeli women tortured and raped, of elders kidnapped, of charred corpses and beheadings, and of children shot dead in their homes have shaken peaceful people to their cores. In one kibbutz, a paramedic named Ahmed was working to save the lives of victims, pouring into a local clinic when she documented what would be the last moments of her own life in messages to her sister. Here's what she said. "They're here. I don't think I'll get out of here alive. Be strong if something happens to me." A few minutes later, in a call from Emmett's phone, all her sister could hear were gunshots and screams. Once in 10 residents of the community were slaughtered by the terrorists.
Part of Senator McConnell's and before him Senator Schumer's remarks during leader time on the floor. And later today in the Senate, lawmakers will debate the nomination of Jennifer Hall to be a U.S. District Court judge for Delaware. A vote to advance her nomination is scheduled later this afternoon. You can watch Senate Live right now on C-SPAN 2. And you can follow live coverage of the House Speaker election on C-SPAN and get full coverage on cspan.org and the free C-SPAN Now mobile app. Tomorrow on Capitol Hill, NCAA President Charlie Baker and Big Ten Commissioner Tony Petitti testify before the Senate Judiciary Committee on name, image, and likeness, or NIL deals, the impact on college athletics, and legislative proposals. That hearing is scheduled for 10 a.m. Eastern Time. And Wednesday, the Senate Foreign Relations Committee holds a hearing on the nomination of Jacob Lew to be U.S. Ambassador to Israel. That is scheduled to start at 10:30 a.m. Eastern Time. You can get scheduling info, stream video live, or on demand anytime. Again, cspan.org and the free C-SPAN Now mobile app. You're listening to Washington Today.
Tonight, watch C-SPAN series in partnership with the Library of Congress, Books That Shaped America. Will feature The Common Law by Oliver Wendell Holmes, Jr. Written in 1881, 2 decades before Holmes would become a Supreme Court justice, the book is from a series of lectures he'd given on criminal and civil law and other legal issues. Controversial at the time, Holmes wrote that the life of the law has not been logic, it has been experience. Jeffrey Rosen, President and CEO of the National Constitution Center, will join us to discuss the book. Watch Books That Shaped America, featuring The Common Law, tonight, live at 9 p.m. Eastern on C-SPAN, C-SPAN Now, our free mobile video app, or online at cspan.org.
Welcome back to Washington Today. A federal judge has issued a gag order on former President Donald Trump that limits what he can say about the Justice Department's prosecution into his alleged attempt to subvert the 2020 presidential election. The order restricts the former president's ability to publicly target court personnel, potential witnesses, or the special counsel Jack Smith and his staff. It does not limit his making disparaging comments about Washington, D.C., where the jury trial will take place, or certain comments about the Justice Department at large. Judge Tanya Chutkan wrote in the order, quote, "This is not about whether I like the language Mr. Trump uses. This is about language that presents a danger to the administration of justice. His presidential candidacy does not give him carte blanche to vilify public servants who are simply doing their jobs." Any violation of the judge's orders could result in sanctions to the former president. His attorneys have said they will appeal the order. Meanwhile, the other Republican presidential candidates were in Nashua, New Hampshire on Friday. They appeared at an event hosted by the Republican State Committee. The terror attacks on Israel were a topic of conversation, starting with former UN Ambassador Nikki Haley.
Whether it was burned bodies, whether it was women that was raped, whether it were people being dragged down the streets of Gaza. I know you saw it, but did you hear it? Did you hear what they were saying when they were dragging those bodies down the street? Because they were saying, death to Israel, death to America. That's what they do. That's how they think. That is why Israel needs to eliminate Hamas once and for all. And the Biden administration has to accept the fact, because everybody in the world knows it. There would be no Hamas if it wasn't for Iran. There would be no Hezbollah if it wasn't for Iran. There would be no Houthis if it wasn't for Iran. There's a reason the foreign minister of Iran is in Lebanon right now meeting with Hezbollah. And what did the Biden administration do? He loosened all the sanctions that gave billions of dollars to Iran. Interestingly enough, China, #1 importer of oil in Iran. Russia, getting their drones from Iran. Look at the triangle, because the triangle is real. And what do they have in common? They all hate the West, and they all hate democracies, and they all hate America.
Florida Governor Ron DeSantis talked about his support for Israel.
That's a new depth of depravity with what Hamas did by decapitating babies, executing elderly people, filming this, putting it out for family members to witness the execution of their loved ones, These are evil, evil people. And this merits an overwhelming response by the state of Israel. We must stand with Israel and their right to defend themselves against the Hamas aggression. They don't have to live like this. And you're already seeing the media look at and blame Israel. They're talking about Gaza, this, that. There's no water. There's no all these other things. The only thing that's going to end this is for Israel to uproot all the infrastructure that Hamas has done, all the terror accoutrements, and makes Hamas no more. That's the only thing that they could possibly do. And here's the thing. If Hamas and Hezbollah and these places, if they lay down their arms tomorrow, you would have peace. If Israel laid down its arms tomorrow, you would see the annihilation of the Jewish state at the hands of those groups. So don't give me moral equivalence. Don't tell me somehow that Israel is to blame. They should be able to defend themselves, and we will support their right to do it.
And Vivek Ramaswamy talked about what he thinks the role the U.S. should play in the conflict.
Our top job as a country today is to make sure that we are strong at home while standing for our allies in Israel. And I think the way we got to approach this is cool, level-headed, calm, and rationality. What does that mean? We have to stand for Israel's right to defend its own borders while making sure that we avoid broader regional conflict and World War III that wouldn't advance American interests. And then most importantly of all, and I say this coming to you today, right now, where I flew here from, was Eagle Pass on our own southern border, still processing what I saw down there, making sure that we protect the homeland right here at home in the United States of America.
And here's Shelley Talcott of Semaphore News on what to look for this week on the Republican side of the campaign trail.
Well, there's a lot happening. We obviously have Trump heading to New York for one of his legal cases. We have Ron DeSantis heading to South Carolina. Some other candidates are going to be heading to Iowa. And then at the end of the month, all of them are going to be heading to Las Vegas for the Republican Jewish Coalition, which, of course, in the wake of what's going on in Israel, has become increasingly important. They've also all just started releasing their fundraising numbers, and so we get to kind of see how their fundraising numbers are ahead of this third debate. So there's a lot going on as we head into the middle of the month here.
Dive into those fundraising numbers, always a lot in those reports. What's the takeaway, though, from what we know so far?
Yeah, Donald Trump has raised the most. He's got the most cash on hand. Tim Scott has a lot of cash on hand as well, which isn't incredibly surprising given how much he got into the race with. Now, notably, he didn't raise as much as some of the other candidates, yet he still has more cash on hand. We have Ron DeSantis having some decent fundraising numbers, less than previous quarters. And then Nikki Haley, we've seen a rise in fundraising numbers, which kind of speaks to her campaign's argument that she has momentum and that she's the one who is coming up ahead in these recent weeks and months as we've seen the first debates finish.
We talk about the week ahead. The candidates recently were just in New Hampshire talking to voters at town halls. What did we find out from their visits to that all-important primary state?
Yeah, New Hampshire has been really interesting because it's an area where a lot of them haven't been as focused on. So all of the candidates really have been banking on Iowa. It's where they see their biggest opportunity. And so we've seen Ron DeSantis going to every single county in Iowa, for example. His campaign has maintained that that's where Donald Trump is at his weakest. On the flip side, we see Chris Christie has really solely focused on New Hampshire. And so that's where Chris Christie sees his opportunity. And so now as we get closer to the actual primaries, we're seeing all of these candidates sort of branch out and start going to these other early voting states that they haven't been to as much anymore. So Ron DeSantis came over. They've talked a lot about faith and freedom at these events. That's going to be really important with New Hampshire voters and Iowa voters. But it's also an opportunity for them to kind of win over independents in this state. And so it's going to be really interesting to see in the next few weeks how big of an effort they put into a state like New Hampshire versus Iowa, where they're all extremely focused on.
Talking about independence, RFK Jr. talking a lot about independence and winning over independents in his bid for the presidency. A story that you wrote about his campaign, Team Trump readying their attacks on RFK Jr. as their concern over spoiler anxiety grows. For a guy who originally Democrats thought might take votes away from Joe Biden, why is Donald Trump worried about RFK Jr.?
Well, the majority of the polls, minus a few outliers, show that RFK Jr. is far more popular among Republicans at this point than he is among Democrats. And so it makes sense that Trump's team would be keeping an eye on him as he launches his independent bid. Now, this is partially because of Kennedy's focus on COVID vaccines that have really pulled in Republican support and at the same time made Democrats a little bit wary of him. And so what we're seeing in the weeks after my piece was published is that we're seeing a lot more animosity from the Republican side. The RNC, a few hours after my piece was published, started launching attacks against Kennedy. They published a press release, 13 reasons why you shouldn't support Kennedy. And the Trump team has told me that they plan to remind voters that he has historically liberal views. And so this is going to be something to kind of keep an eye on as we head into a general is, will an independent spoil the race for either of these candidates? And at this point, it looks like Trump's team is a little bit more nervous than Biden's team.
And then lastly, from the week ahead on the campaign trail to the month ahead, I want to look ahead to November 8th, the third Republican debate set in Miami on November 8th. What will you be watching for leading into that debate?
The first thing I'm going to be watching for is who makes the debate stage. So one of the arguments I've been hearing from some of these campaigns is that the field is going to naturally winnow. And we've sort of seen that. Will Hurd recently dropped out and endorsed Nikki Haley. We've seen some of another one or two of the lower candidates seem like they might be close to dropping out. And so who's going to make the debate stage is going to be really big. But at the same time, I'm going to be looking for if anyone can really break out at these last two debates, even as, Nikki Haley has argued that she broke out, Ron DeSantis has argued that he broke out. It hasn't really been shown in the poll numbers. And so I'm looking to see if anyone can use these debates and really get serious momentum, not just to get into a second place, but take it to Trump.
Sema 4 News politics reporter Shelley Talcott. You can see all of our campaign 2024 coverage at cspan.org. Finally, tonight, episode 5 of our series Books That Shaped America debuts. In partnership with the Library of Congress, we're exploring 10 books from American literature that provoke thought, won awards, led to significant societal changes, and are still talked about today. Tonight, we look at The Common Law by Oliver Wendell Holmes, Jr. Written in 1881, 2 decades before he would become a Supreme Court justice, the book is from a series of lectures he had given on criminal and civil law and other legal issues. And our own Peter Slen, who is the series host and the executive producer of Book TV, which airs every Sunday on C-SPAN 2, told us about the series and tonight's episode.
So a lot went into putting this 10-week series together. We chose our books from a larger list put together by the Library of Congress. The Library of Congress came up with a list of 100 books that shaped America in 2013. These aren't necessarily bestsellers. They aren't classics. They aren't the best works ever written. But they are books that have had an impact on our country at the time and today and have shaped who we are. So in this series so far, we have looked at America's foundations with Thomas Paine's Common Sense and the Federalist Papers. We looked at America's expansion with the Lewis and Clark expedition. We looked at the overarching issue of slavery in America with Frederick Douglass's Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass, which was published in 1845. Coming up, we're going to be looking at The Common Law with Oliver Wendell Holmes, Huckleberry Finn with Mark Twain, My Antonia, Willa Cather, Their Eyes Were Watching God, Zora Neale Hurston, Cesar Chavez, Milton Friedman, These are some of the books that are coming up in the series.
Now, do you have a favorite of these 10 books?
Yes. And I'm not going to tell you what it is.
Okay.
And if you want to know, was it difficult to pick 10 from the 100? Yes. And I have the white sheets to prove it. We were going through, there were 3 of us working on this, and we were going through and crossing out and creating different lists. And it was a compromise that we came up with these 10. We could have come up with 14 other different lists.
Now, what can we look forward to tonight with Oliver Wendell Holmes on the common law?
Gary, the common law is still taught in law schools today. It was written in 1881. Oliver Wendell Holmes was about 40 years old, 20 years before he was even nominated to the Supreme Court, where he served for 30 years. In 1881, America was maturing. It was growing. It had a history at this point. It had a history of jurisprudence. Oliver Wendell Holmes, as a member of the Massachusetts Supreme Court, sat down, talked about how the law had been developed and how he thought it should go moving forward.
Why did we decide to focus on books that shaped America? What was important? Why was this an important series for C-SPAN to make?
Books That Shaped America turned out to be a pretty natural series for us here at C-SPAN. Of course, we have book TV every weekend, so we spend a lot of time with books. In many ways, the books that we chose were timeless and impactful, and that was the point of the series.
You can listen and watch Books That Shaped America on The Common Law by Oliver Wendell Holmes tonight at 9 p.m. Eastern Time here on C-SPAN Radio and on C-SPAN. And be sure to check out our companion podcast. This week we talked to Stephen Budiansky, who wrote Oliver Wendell Holmes, A Life in War, Law, and Ideas. A little deeper dive on the author and his work. You can find the Books That Shaped America companion podcast at cspan.org/podcasts. You can also find it on the podcast tab on the C-SPAN Now free mobile app or wherever you get your podcasts. That's also where you can find this program as a podcast. And you can get it on YouTube. Just search Washington Today. And for more on the stories that are shaping Washington every day, get our free daily email word for word. You can go to cspan.org/connect to subscribe. I'm Gary Sterkoff. Thanks a lot for listening today to Washington Today.
C-SPAN's Washington Journal, our live forum involving you to discuss the latest issues in government, politics, and public policy from Washington, D.C. and across the country. Coming up Tuesday morning, The Hill's Michael Schnell talks about the latest on the House Speaker battle and previews tomorrow's expected vote on the House floor. And then University of Maryland Sadat Professor of Peace and Development Shelley Talcott talks about the latest in the Israel-Hamas conflict and the looming humanitarian crisis in Gaza. And we'll talk about U.S. aid to Ukraine and Israel with Jim Gilmore, former Republican Virginia governor and former U.S. ambassador to the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. C-SPAN's Washington Journal. Join in the conversation live at 7 Eastern Tuesday morning on C-SPAN, C-SPAN Now, or online at cspan.org.